Hey everyone. So I know I already have a lot of lectures on Blackboard, but throughout the semester, I'm going to be throwing up a few more. And so we're starting our class this semester with Dracula because I think in a class called Popular Literature, it's probably one of the most popular things we're reading. And so, what I wanted to do today was just give you a little bit of background on Bram Stoker himself. We know so much about Dracula, but a lot of people don't know much about Bram Stoker. So, he was born Abraham Stoker in 1847, so mid 19th century. And he was born in a town called Clontarf, which is very close to Dublin, Ireland. So we're just going to say he's from Dublin. He spent much of his life, though, as an invalid, right? He claimed that he couldn't stand upright until he was about 7 years old. Um, but we don't really know why he was so sickly as a child. We just know that he was. Um, in terms of schooling, he was incredibly well read. He attended Trinity College in Dublin. Um, and he was a student of science and pure mathematics, which is weird because he wrote so prolifically. But his interest in literature and the arts soon became clear, right? So it's okay for you to study science and math. Well, it was okay for him to study that. But in the back of his mind, he was always interested in literature. And that's something I get because not a lot of you know this, but my very first major in college was computer science. And then it was biology. And here I am today. But it's one of those things where I was studying all of these other majors, but I always kind of went back to literature. And so while he's studying science and math, he's also giving talks on Shakespeare and Keats and Shelley. And one of his favorite writers was Walt Whitman, who wrote the very controversial Leaves of Grass. In fact, he defended Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which was published in 1855, at a time when it was generally condemned as being offensive and immoral. And so here's Bram Stoker going, you know what, calm down. So yeah, he was very well read. Um, when he graduated from the college, he worked as a civil servant. And in a few years later, he was promoted to inspector of petty sessions. While he was working at Dublin Castle, that's where he worked as a civil servant, he also began writing. He also wrote reviews. And one of the things he did was he wrote reviews for the Dublin Mail. And it was unpaid. He was an unpaid journalist for doing this, but he loved literature so much. In fact, his highly complimentary appraisal of Shakespearean actor Henry Irving is what led him to take a sort of different path in life. Okay. In 1878, Stoker became manager of Irving's Lyceum Theater. Irving was a pretty big name for the theater at that time. So he became his manager. And in 1878, he also married Florence Balcom, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. A year after the marriage, they had one son, Noel. Stoker, at this point, is really important in London society. Okay. His wife was beautiful. His son was healthy. They were always at parties. They were always kind of in society, entertaining and being entertained by other kind of celebrities. Um, so Stoker ended up devoting a large portion of his life and his time to Henry Irving, who would become his best friend in the theater. However, in 1882, he was on his way to America when there was an elderly man attempting to jump over the side of a boat. Stoker saved his life and he received a bronze medal. In 1883, he and Irving made their first tours of America. And when he got here, Stoker was fascinated by our country. So that makes me happy that he came here and he liked it. So America was always kind of this land that fascinated him. In terms of his writing, his first short story, The Crystal Cup, was published in 1872. 3 years later, his first horror story, The Chain of Destiny, was published. About 20 years later, we get his first novel, The Water's Mouth. Um, yeah, it's a melodrama. A few years later, we get Dracula. And Dracula became probably the novel he's most known for. The year after Dracula, he wrote another novel called Miss Betty. The year after that, uh, or not the year after that, a few years later, 1903, he wrote his novel, The Jewel of the Seven Stars. Now, we had a big jump between Miss Betty and The Jewel because in 1898, the same year Miss Betty came out, the Lyceum Theater caught on fire. And so a lot of their equipment, like the scenes and the props, were destroyed. And so there was a lot of financial difficulties rising here to try and get it back together. So, 1903, we have The Jewel of the Seven Stars, an Orientalist Gothic novel centering on the resurrection of the Egyptian Queen Tara. In 1905, we have his novel, The Man, the story of an independent woman with masculine tendencies. In 1908, we have his novel, Lady Atheling. Let's see, Lady Atheling. Yeah, Lady Atheling, The Lady of the Shroud, and The Lair of the White Worm. Those are his last three novels. And they're all focusing on powerful women. In fact, most of his novels, including Dracula, have some powerful women in them. So the last thing he wrote, though, was The Lair of the White Worm, which is the story of Lady Arabella, a giant primordial worm who terrorizes the countryside. And in fact, The Lair of the White Worm is probably his most famous work after Dracula. So if you want to read about a nightmarish worm, I suggest you pick that one up. In 1905, right? So right before he started his last three novels, Irving, his best friend, dies, and Stoker is devastated, incredibly devastated. He's so upset that a lot of people say that the stroke that Stoker has 1 year later in 1906 is a result of his devastation. After this stroke, his eyesight and his walk were permanently impaired. Now, remember, he was already an invalid as a child, so he was probably sickly for a large portion of his life. As a result of this stroke, his eyesight is messed up, his walk is messed up, and he's frequently confined to his bed. In fact, his only source of income then becomes his writing. In 1912, April 20th, 1912, Stoker dies. And a lot of people thought that he died because of some kind of STD or syphilis, but it actually is suggested that he died because of a stroke. Okay. So all of this information comes from your introduction to the novel. If you purchase the Broadview edition with the introduction by Glennis Byron, it has this very kind of detailed biography of Bram Stoker that I suggest you all kind of glance at. Other than that, thank you all for listening, and I plan on doing another video for the novel itself. So keep a lookout for that as well. See you all later. Goodbye.